my honor to be able to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Chris Lowe. He's originally from the East Coast, and he received his bachelor in marine biology at Barrington College in Rhode Island. I won't tell you the year. His master's in biology at California State University, Long Beach, and his PhD, woohoo, yeah, go Beach. His PhD in zoology at the University of Hawaii. I first met Chris when I was an undergraduate student at Cal State Long Beach, go Beach. I was taking Dr. Miller's class, his tropical marine ecology class, where we got to go to Hawaii and went to Coconut Island. And Chris was a PhD student there studying hammerhead sharks. And he showed our class some of the tanks that he had some of the animals in and some of the sharks. And I remember thinking to myself, this young undergraduate student, I want to be like him when I grow up. I didn't end up studying sharks. I ended up studying parasites of fishes, which sharks, of course, are loaded with parasites. Right, Ralph? Yay, parasites? But Chris and I, we've been friends ever since we met on Coconut Island. Even after he played a joke on me when I was a graduate student. You know what I'm talking about. So I was a graduate student at UCLA, and I was studying for my oral exams. And I happened to run into Chris a few weeks before that, and I was razzled, as anybody is that needs to study for their orals. It's a big deal when you're getting your PhD. And he decides to tell me that you need to learn the Krebs cycle. And those of you that don't know what the Krebs cycle is, it's a very complicated chemical reaction that occurs in living cells, and it produces ATP, blah, blah, blah. Very complicated, nothing to do with what I'm doing my research on. And he said, you need to know that. Everybody gets asked that in the orals. If you don't know your Krebs cycle, how are you going to get your PhD? So I memorized the Krebs cycle. And how many of you think I got asked the Krebs cycle during my orals? No, I did not. I was like, oh, dang that, Chris Lowe. Anyways, in 1998, he was hired as a professor of marine biology at Cal State University, Long Beach, where he runs the CSULB Shark Lab, which is originally founded by Dr. Don Nelson. Dr. Lowe and his students use acoustic and satellite telemetry techniques to study the movement, behavior, and physiology of sharks, rays, and many other game fishes. They have been studying the white sharks of Southern California for over 9 years, and some of his recent research has focused on the development of underwater robots for tracking sharks. In 2009, he received the university's Outstanding Professor Award, and in 2012, he received the Impact in Research Award. The title of his talk tonight is Return of the Big Marine Predators to California Waters, a sign things might be getting better. Please help me welcome Dr. Chris Lowe.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I love coming to Cabrillo. It's one of my favorite places to come give talks, and I really have to thank Mike for always encouraging us from Long Beach to come and speak. Tonight, I'm going to talk about something, believe me, I'm going to talk about sharks. But in my research studying white sharks, I came to realize that there were some other important predators that are kind of dependent on white sharks, or white sharks are dependent on them, and I ended up with a lot of questions that took me beyond just white sharks. And tonight I'm going to share with you a little bit of the journey that I had as I started to study white sharks and find maybe that the population's increasing. So, but before I get to that, it really got me thinking about, is it possible that a predator population can be increasing? And the challenging part of this is that we're all bombarded with doom and gloom. These are the things that we hear on a day-to-day basis. We hear about overfishing, we hear about disease and global climate change and ocean acidification and dead zones. So we get bombarded with this information, and even as a scientist sometimes, it's hard to wonder, am I actually seeing anything get better? So I'm doing all this research. Can things be getting better when we hear this all the time? And believe it or not, it affects us too. So the bottom line is, where does all this come from? Well, it comes from the fact that we have a growing problem, right? So this growing problem has been this massive increase in the number of humans on our planet. And we've just surpassed 9 billion people. Well, it's not just the planet that's experiencing this sort of population growth, it's California. So the state of California has experienced amazing population growth. We're now getting up close to 38 million people in the state of California, which, by the way, about 25 million live within 60 miles of the coast. So a very large proportion of these people are living close to the coast and dependent on the coast as part of their livelihoods, as part of our economy. So even California has experienced this rapid population growth. So what's come with that? What have we contributed to our environment as our populations have grown? So while many of you are going, I thought this was going to be a sharp talk, well, let's start talking about air, right? So air quality in California, particularly in Southern California, was known to be particularly bad. In fact, in the 40s, it was so bad that people were actually worried about going outside. There were regular advisories about going outside. And we had actually our worst air quality back in the 40s. But it was really in the 70s, 60s and 70s that citizens were saying, this is unacceptable. We have to do something about this. We need more research about what is contributing to this pollution in the air, how it's affecting other parts of the environment. And that movement actually helped drive the Clean Air Act, which was passed in 1970 in Washington, D.C., largely based on some of the things that were happening here in California. Now, what does air quality have to do with the ocean? Well, it has to do a lot with the ocean because it contributes things directly to the ocean. So here we are in the 2000s, 2014, and we actually have much better air quality now, despite the fact that we have 3 times more people living in Southern California than we did when it was worse. So air quality has actually gotten better because we've invested in this. In addition, we had all these people living along the coast, all of whom had to go to the bathroom every day. And of course, all of that was getting discharged offshore. So up until the 70s, we were discharging raw sewage offshore. In some cases, pipes that were no more than a mile offshore. And we had pretty poor water quality in California, in Southern California. So as the result, not only was it discharging lots of nutrients that was affecting our coastal ocean, but we were also discharging lots of pollutants, industrial pollutants. LA is well known for a lot of its industry. And a lot of these contaminants were being discharged through the wastewater treatment system up into the 70s. So because of such abysmal water quality, biologists were seeing direct effects to marine communities. This, along with many other places, burning rivers in places like Ohio, were what contributed to the Clean Water Act, which was passed in 1972. Since then, actually water quality has gotten much better. So we now have full secondary treatment for accommodating almost 20 million people in Southern California, and in some cases we're moving towards tertiary wastewater treatment. So with 3 times more people living in the state, we have improved water quality going into our ocean. Now we still have problems. We still have trash and issues and things that get washed out storm drains, and we're working to fix those, but by and large, when you think of what we've accomplished for water quality, is absolutely astounding. It is the best wastewater treatment that exists anywhere in the world. Jeff, that one's for you. Yeah. In addition, we've lived in a community of fish lovers, of seafood lovers, and we've been very good about eating our seafood, particularly in Southern California. In fact, much of California's early economies were built around commercial fishing. So as a result, we've seen a lot of different fisheries come and go. So I'm going to give you a quick rundown on the various commercial fisheries that have been in California, Southern California, and gone. So one fishery called the purse seine fishery developed in 1915, and it was targeting things like tuna, barracuda, white sea bass, wet fish, sardines, mackerels, and anchovies. And this basically is a net that you put out in the ocean around a school of fish, and you purse up the bottom, and you can catch a whole school. Most of that fleet, in fact, San Pedro, was largely developed, as well as San Diego Bay was the main supporter of the tuna fleet that existed here. It's gone. All of those fleets are gone. The primary commercial purse seine fishery left is the market squid fishery, and it is now the largest commercial fishery that exists in California. All the rest of the purse seine fisheries are gone from California. We had trawling. Trawling started back as early as the 40s, and trawls are designed to drag along the bottom and catch fish that live along the bottom. And in Southern California, because we have a fairly large continental shelf, there was plenty of habitat to drag. So the species targeted were things like halibut and sole. We eventually figured out how to put wheels on our nets so that we could drag it across rocks. When we did that, we started to catch rockfish. And as a result of some of the damage that was being done to many of these habitats in depleting catch, there's now only about 6 or 8 trawlers left in Southern California. And there's only 3 places left that they can trawl in Southern California. So that fleet, that industry is pretty much gone. Entangle nets, known as trammel nets or gill nets, these are invisible nets, walls of water that we put in the water that fish can swim into and they get caught around the gills. This actually started in the 40s. And when they started gill netting in the 40s, they were using cotton line. It wasn't very effective. Fish could see the line and it didn't work as well. But in the 70s, with the advent of plastic, they developed monofilament. Monofilament was great. Here's a wall of net that you could put in the water that turned invisible when it entered the water. And it became a really lucrative fishery. There were a lot of people got into this fishery. So in the 70s is when it really started. It really picked up in the 80s. It peaked in about mid-80s. And by the mid-90s, that fishery was already crashing for a number of reasons. And I'll talk more about those in a minute. But as a result of depletion of target species and high bycatch, the state of California passed a gill net ban for the use of gill nets in nearshore waters in 1994. Hook and line, we've had long line, commercial long line for offshore species like swordfish, tuna. We've had nearshore long line, most of those are gone. And we've replaced many of those long line hooks with recreational angler hooks. So now we have a very large recreational angler fleet out there, people that are out fishing, and we've replaced many of those hooks. So this is largely the remaining hook and line fishery that exists in California. So most of the commercial fisheries that our economy was based on are gone. Nevertheless, in 100 years, we managed to do a lot of damage to the marine environment. And it wasn't just the things that we were eating. We were harvesting a lot of marine mammals. A lot of marine mammals were harvested for their skins, for their oil. Many were hunted to near extinction, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. We had a lot of dirty fisheries. We had fisheries that had grown that were largely not well regulated. They were catching a lot of bycatch. Many of that bycatch included marine mammals and birds. And in general, all the fisheries were targeting primarily large predators, and we saw a systematic depletion of large predators in our ocean. They've been gone for almost 100 years. So as a result of this overfishing that we were experiencing, it wasn't just here in California, it was nationwide, worldwide. But as a result, we passed the Marine Mammal Protection Act in 1973 because of the damage we were doing to marine mammal populations. I mean, most were hunted to the verge of extinction. We had a state ban on gill nets in 1994, the Magnuson-Stevens Act, which is the federal act that required the national government and regional areas to regulate fisheries, to minimize bycatch, and to properly manage fisheries in order to have them sustainable. In addition, California passed the Marine Life Protection Act and the Marine Life Management Act in 1999, and again, requiring the state of California to do the same thing. So we've recognized all these problems with air, with water, with overfishing, and we've done things about them. We've put legislation in place to try to remedy these problems. So the problem with all of these things is the organisms most affected by them are the ones at the top of the food chain. So it's really been the predators that have felt the greatest toll of air pollution, water pollution, overfishing. So they occur fewer in number, and as a result, they're reliant on lower trophic levels in order to find their food. So if you remove these predators at the top first, you have cascading effects that can have situations that drive the food web out of whack. So for almost 100 years now, we've systematically removed all our ocean predators, and we've been suffering from a food web that's been out of whack. So the bottom line with the top predators is it's not just fishing out just the big ones, direct mortality. So it's not just taking those out that have effects on them. When you do that, we have cascading effects that can cause a depletion of food that those individuals are dependent on. And when those are gone, some of them may simply starve to death. There's no food for them. And others may leave because food resources have been depleted too low. And we end up with a food web that's largely lacking large predators. So probably one of the greatest examples of changes that we've seen in our coastal ocean that many of us could give you evolves around this gill net story. And I think it provides a great case study for how things have changed in our coastal oceans. Here's one fishery. So let me tell you a little bit about it. So it started, remember I told you it started in the 70s. It really peaked in the mid-80s through 90s. There were really two types of fishing. There was an offshore drift gill net fishery that was miles and miles offshore, and they were targeting things like swordfish, thresher sharks, and makos. And basically, this fisherman would deploy a net out into the ocean. It would float, and they would come back and pick it up at a later time and retrieve their nets and get their catch. In addition, we also had a nearshore drift net and set net fishery that was targeting things like white sea bass, California halibut, and angel sharks. So these were literally being set from the shoreline offshore to target these species that occur in schools. Some of them occur in schools, and others may make coastal migrations, and it made it easy for them to catch them. So this fishery started in the 70s. It really started to grow very, very quickly in the 80s. It quickly became overcapitalized. Everybody that could afford to buy a boat, could afford to buy nets, was getting into this fishery. So as a result of this rapid growth in this fishery, largely uncontrolled growth in this fishery, they saw a rapid decline in the target species. These were the species that they were targeting. Thresher sharks were greatly reduced, mako sharks, white sea bass, California halibut. All these populations were negatively impacted by the rapid growth of this very effective fishery. But it was really the bycatch that did this fishery in. In addition, that nearshore fishery was catching lots and lots of marine mammals, sea lions, harbor seals, birds. And it was really the bycatch of these species that convinced California taxpayers that gill nets do not belong in nearshore waters. And it was in 1994 that gill net ban was passed. So what has happened since that ban? What if we remove those gill nets since that time period? Has anything changed? So you got to understand there was a lot of effort put in both these fisheries. So the blue line you see is the set gill net fishery, and we can see that fishery in 1985 peaked. So at that time, there were over 1,000 boats permitted to fish this gill net fishery in California. So it peaked, and then we see that the effort in both the offshore drift gill net fishery and the nearshore drift gill net fishery rapidly declined. Well, why is it going down? Well, it's going down because they're not catching anything anymore, and they're getting more and more regulations put on them because of the bycatch issue. So in 1994, the gill net ban goes into place. The offshore drift gill net fishery became heavily regulated because of bycatch and because of declining catch of target species. So since 1994, gill net fishing effort has been fairly stable in California. Now remember, gill netters can still fish outside 3 miles, and there are only a few places in the California coast where it's shallow enough for them to still do that. But the bottom line is, there are only 16 vessels left in this fleet. That's it. That's all that exists. And those vessels may be completely gone within the next 2 years. While there's 140 permits left in the nearshore set gill net fishery fleet, there's really only about 40 boats that still fish in that fleet. And they cannot fish inside state waters. They can only fish outside 3 miles. So since its peak, we've seen an 82% reduction in gill net effort alone. So that's just this one fishery. So if we look at where gill net fishing was occurring in California, so this is the Southern California Bight, here's Point Conception, Santa Barbara, the offshore Channel Islands, here's San Diego, the Mexican border. These blocks that you see are called Cal Fish and Game blocks. So when a fisher catches fish, instead of having to give their secret spot, all they have to say is, I caught it in this block. So each block has a number. So these blocks are 10 nautical miles by 10 nautical miles. So what you can see is prior to 1994, pretty much every area in Southern California Bight had been fished with gill nets. After 1994, and the restriction of the gill net fishery and the offshore fishery, this is going to morph, we see that effort has now been greatly reduced, but the places that are being fished are these same hot spots along the coast, but they can't fish inside 3 nautical miles. So that gill net fishery has been greatly reduced, and it's also been pushed out to certain areas. So now the question is, we've banned the use of gill nets in state waters since 1994. Has it had any impacts? Well, if we look at target species, we take white sea bass. Larry Allen did a study where he looked at white sea bass landings. These are in metric tons, and you can see back in 1956, we had this unbelievable record catch that we've never had since. But the fishery kind of fluctuated, went up and down, and then here's where the gill net fishery starts, right? 80s, look at white sea bass population, just hammered. It was pretty much nothing left. But since the nearshore gill net ban, we're seeing white sea bass come back. In addition, newer numbers are showing that that increasing trend is continuing to go up. So just the banning of nearshore gill nets has allowed even target species to increase. Recreational fishers are now catching white sea bass, which they didn't for many, many years. So what about other species that were caught in the gill net fishery as bycatch? Well, Dan Pondella and Larry Allen published a study, once again, looking at the gill net fishery impacts of these species since then, and they used fishery-independent data. They used diver surveys, they used scientific fishing to look at recovery of other populations. Giant black sea bass populations were negatively impacted by nearshore gill net fishery, and since then, we're seeing a steady increase in black sea bass. They're coming back. And the ones that we're seeing are getting bigger. Hopefully we'll get to the point where we'll see those 200 and 300 pounders again. It may take decades, but we're getting there. Soup fin shark, taupe, have been coming back. So these populations were also greatly impacted by the gill net fishery and are also showing an upward trajectory. And the same is true for leopard sharks. We're seeing more and more leopard sharks. So simply banning the use of gill nets in nearshore waters have allowed not just target species to come back, but many species that were bycatch in these fisheries. Their populations are recovering. So the problem is you think, okay, well, is banning gill nets enough? We hear all the time that we've overfished the oceans. The ocean's so polluted, nothing can survive in it. Well, how can those populations be going up if it's that bad? But this is the species that really, and it's not just California sea lions, it's harbor seals, it's dolphins, it's great whales, it's California elephant seals, northern elephant seals. All of their populations have shown trajectories that look like this. In 1920, it was estimated that there were as few as 2,000 California sea lions left in all of California and Baja. They had been hunted to virtual extinction. Marine mammal biologists at that point thought they were done. They were gone. If a fisherman saw a California sea lion, they'd simply shoot them. They considered them as competitors, and they would shoot them. So remember what happened in 1973? Marine Mammal Protection Act comes into place. Now it's illegal to just kill these animals, and look at what the population starts to do. In the mid-1980s, anybody remember what happened in the mid-1980s? We had a strong El Nino, and you know what? That had direct impacts on many marine organisms, including California sea lions. But in the mid-1990s, remember, we banned the use of nearshore gill nets, and we greatly regulated the offshore gill net fishery, and look what the California sea lions population's been doing since then. It's grown at a rate of 6.5% per year. Marine mammal biologists thought that was impossible. In fact, as of 2012, NOAA concluded, based on beach counts, that they estimated to be 470,000 California sea lions now, and that the population has probably reached its carrying capacity. So my question for you is, how can these populations be recovering if there's nothing left for them to eat? If the ocean is so polluted that there's nothing for them to eat, how can these populations be recovering? So what really got me scratching my head, and again, it makes sense because we hear over and over again, bad things are happening in the ocean. And I'm not saying they're not, but we hear it over and over again. So 2 years ago, a couple conservation groups submitted petitions to the state and federal government to list white sharks as threatened and endangered. And their argument for that was actually based on some of the data that we collected. So one of the things they concluded was that there were only 350 sharks, white sharks, in the Northeast Pacific, and that white sharks are being killed in commercial fisheries. They also argued that the populations were dangerously low. And of course, pollution was negatively affecting them. So the thing is they actually used some of our data in their report, in their petition, but the problem was we weren't necessarily seeing the same trends that they claimed they were seeing. So this really got me thinking, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the white shark population isn't increasing. So let's talk a little bit about white sharks. That's why everybody came, right? You're here to talk about sharks. Finally, you're thinking, finally, he's going to talk about sharks. So the bottom line is white sharks are not at the top of the food chain. We're at the top of the food chain. And they're vulnerable to overfishing because of their life history. In many ways, they're just like us. They take 7 to 12 years to reach sexual maturity. They may reproduce every 2 to 3 years. They may live to be 70 years old. In many ways, they have life history characteristics akin of that of people. But they are valued. They're valued for their teeth. They're valued for their meat. They're valued for their fins. So if fishers did catch them, they would kill them and sell them. Now, despite the fact that they are of value, there's never been a directed fishery for white sharks simply because they don't occur in high numbers. At least as best we know, they've never occurred in high numbers. But compared to other species of sharks, they do occasionally get caught as bycatch in fisheries. And when they were caught in fisheries, quite often they were landed and sold. So the thing that still amazes me is white sharks kind of have a reputation. There's an entire week of international programming based on them because of the reputation that they have for occasionally nibbling on people. So the thing that gets me, the thing that I still am amazed at is in 1994, because of that reputation, the state of California passed legislation to protect white sharks, mainly because we understood this. We understood that they were susceptible to overfishing. In 1997, they were protected in the US Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. In 2004, they were protected by CITES so that their parts and teeth and skin and fins could not be traded internationally. And in 2005, they were protected throughout the rest of US waters. They've been protected in Australia, South Africa, Mexico, and New Zealand for almost more than a decade or almost 20 years now. So white sharks have been afforded protection, in some cases, for almost 2 decades. So what do we know about white sharks in California? Well, we've learned a lot in the last 20 years. In fact, 20 years ago, if you'd asked a shark biologist what kind of shark we thought a white shark was, we would have said, oh, they're a coastal shark. And if somebody were to say, well, how do you know that? We'd say, well, in the fall, we see them around these seal rookeries up around San Francisco. But we didn't have any technology to figure out where they were going. Since then, colleagues have been tagging and tracking them from places around Andy Nuevo and the Farallon Islands. Another population of adults have been found around Guadalupe, and these are aggregation sites where the adults come. And using new technology called satellite telemetry, these colleagues have been able to tag these animals and have found that white sharks aren't coastal sharks at all. White sharks around these aggregation sites act like ocean sharks. They're spending 8 months to a year and a half out in the middle of the Pacific or going to Hawaii. Even the ones at Guadalupe go out there. So we've learned a lot about white sharks in the last 20 years. And we now know that they're really not by the coast as much as we thought. So what do we know about the babies? Well, it turns out we're really lucky in that we have the nursery ground for the white sharks in our front yard. That's right. Southern California is the nursery ground for the white sharks of the Northeast Pacific. So it's along our beaches from Santa Barbara down to Baja are the places where adults presumably come to give birth. We don't see them. Nobody's ever seen them giving birth. We don't see a lot of adult white sharks around our shore, but what we see starting around this time of year are a lot of babies. So one of the things we wanted to do is we want to look at, well, what's known about records of different size classes of white sharks and what fisheries might they be interacting with? Are fisheries really negatively impacting these populations, as the petitions were saying? So we looked through as many records as we could find, Gill Net log books and PACFIN, which is a recreational fishing record, and scientific collections. So we combed through all these records, and we found 369 records going back to 1936 of where white sharks have been caught in any fishery. And in some of the records, it actually gave us information about the sizes of sharks caught. Well, not surprising, in all the different fisheries, the most common size of sharks caught in the fishery are what we call young of the year. These are what we call baby white sharks. They're less than a year old, young of the years. So they constituted a bulk. And then we got some juveniles, which are about 6 to about 12 feet long, and then anything over almost 12 feet long is considered a subadult or an adult. So when we looked at what fishery was most responsible for the capture of white sharks, we found, not surprisingly, that the Gill Net fishery, that fishery that I just talked about that had a lot of impacts on all these different species, was probably also having a pretty big impact on white sharks. A majority of what were being caught were these young of the year, but there were some juveniles. When we look at the other fisheries, we see that they're not really catching very many. Some recreational anglers have been catching them off piers going back 30 years. So we know that this population is largely these young ones, and we're probably directly being impacted by the gill net fishery. So when we look at the location of where fishers reported catching these sharks, we see some really interesting patterns. So these are for the adults. And one of the things you'll notice is that right off Palos Verdes, off Catalina, and off Anacapa seem to be the locations where most of the adults were reported caught. But remember, there weren't very many actually caught. When we look at juveniles, we see that now the juveniles are being caught more along the coastline, off Santa Barbara and Ventura, off Santa Monica, off Long Beach and Huntington Beach, off Dana Point and San Diego. But it's really the young of the year that shows us the most interesting pattern. The babies seem to be caught primarily in these coastal areas. So off Ventura, off Santa Monica, off Huntington Beach, off Dana Point, and off San Diego. So based on this, we would say, well, the adults may be offshore, and the young ones are inshore. But remember, we're only using fisheries data to infer this. So, but how do we know that maybe the population's increasing? So when we look at the records of gill net fishing efforts, so this is that nearshore gill net fishery, this is the offshore gill net fishery, this is the number of nets they set per year, and we look at the reported catch of white sharks in that fishery, we see that in 1985, remember that's the peak of that gill net fishery, well that's when they caught the peak of number of white sharks in that fishery. So this fishery was probably having direct negative impacts on the white shark population, primarily from catching and killing these babies. Now when fishermen caught them, they would flay them out, take them to market, and they were probably sold. So anybody that ate shark in California in the late 80s through mid-90s, there's a chance if you just ate shark, you might have eaten white shark. So, but we see that the number of white sharks being caught kind of increases and decreases with effort. But in 1994, that nearshore gill net ban goes into place, and the protection for white sharks goes into place in 1994. So if a fisherman catches a white shark, they've got to let him go. So since then, we see that gill net fishing effort has been fairly stable. And remember, there's been an 82% reduction since its peak. But since then, what we've been seeing is this steady increase in the number of young of the year white sharks being caught in gill nets, the remaining gill net fleet, and there's not very many boats. So, but we see that the numbers have been steadily increasing since 2005. So how do we explain this? So one way of looking at this is, well, you know, maybe the population is increasing. But again, when we saw these data, we're thinking, well, is it possible? Can white sharks really, population go up this way? If we have all these juveniles coming in, and more juveniles are being caught, somebody has to be giving birth to those juveniles, which means there has to be more adults. So remember, protection goes in place for white sharks in 1994. The time to reach sexual maturity is about 12 years. So the time span that we're starting to see would indicate that individuals protected since then would be coming into sexual maturity, be giving birth to new individuals by now. So this suggests that, yes, maybe the population's increasing. So in order to help figure out to what extent this fishery may be impacting the white shark population and determine whether the population is coming back or not, for the last 8 years, we've been working with commercial fishermen. And Chuck Winkler, who's here, has been working with us. Chuck's been a great liaison with a commercial, this is a picture of Chuck right here. So if a commercial fisherman caught a white shark in their nets, they would call us up. Chuck, my grad students, myself would go down, we'd meet the fishermen would put them in their tote. So here's a fisherman's tote, it's about 4 feet wide by about 4 feet deep. Here's a little white shark in the tote. These are California halibut, legal size California halibut. So the fishermen bring the sharks back in the totes, meet us at the dock. My students and I would take tissue samples, measurements, blood samples. We'd tag them with different types of transmitters. And then the fishermen would take us back offshore and we would release them, let them go. Now, in doing this, enabled us to do 2 things. One, it would enable us to determine how many sharks caught in fishermen's nets could actually survive. But the other thing is, because we're putting our spy technology on these sharks, we could follow the individuals around and see where they go. So in order to do this, we needed a variety of different types of technology. So one type of transmitters that we use are called satellite transmitters. So one type are called spot tags, and these actually get bolted to the shark's fin. And the only time a satellite transmitter can actually transmit is when it's in air. So the antenna has to be in air. So when the shark comes to the surface and its antenna is in air, it can send a signal up to the satellites, and then we can actually get an email message saying, hey, shark number 205 was just detected at this longitude and latitude. In addition, we have another type of tag that we can put on the shark that measures temperature, depth, and light. These tags stay on the shark and at a pre-described date will pop off, float to the surface, and download all its data to the satellite. So we can use this as a technique to follow sharks around. But both of these require that these devices come to the surface. So in order to detect where sharks are going while they're underwater, we also use this technique called acoustic telemetry. So we surgically implant these acoustic transmitters into these sharks. The transmitters have battery lives from 8 to 10 years. Each transmitter has a unique ID code, and when they swim by these acoustic receivers that we have all along the coast, it's like an easy pass for sharks. So when they swim past, we know who came by, the time and date that they swim by that location. So here's a map that shows all the fishing locations. So the redder the color shows the more gill net effort. And remember, they can't fish inside this white line. That's state waters. So think of that area inside there as a no-take zone for gill netting. And these symbols that you see indicate locations where fishers had caught sharks. So if you looked at these data alone, you would say, wow, these fishermen and the sharks are in the same place. There's a lot of interaction here. That can't be good. So these sharks are being in the same place where the fishermen are. That's not a good sign, right? However, remember I told you we had that spy technology on the sharks? The satellite transmitters, when the sharks come to the surface, we could get a position of where they're at. These dots that you see indicate locations that we got from sharks when their fins came to the surface. All the white spots you see are detections inside 3 nautical miles, which means they're effectively protected from gill net fishing. So 44% of the detections we got were inside state waters. So think of it like a marine protected area for sharks, for white sharks. All the black points you see are detections outside 3 nautical miles, but notice, most of the points aren't necessarily just in the reddest spots, which means these white sharks are moving all over the place. They're not always in the same place where the fishery is all the time. They probably go to those red spots for the same reason the fishermen go to the red squares, because it's very productive. So not all the sharks that fishermen have been catching have been alive. In fact, some of the sharks have been dead. On average, from 2006 to 2012, 44 plus or minus 24% of the sharks are found dead in the nets when the fishermen pull their nets. So we were a little interested in that. We wanted to learn more about that. But the thing that we found amazing was the sharks that the fishers caught that were alive. We had no idea how long they were in the nets. Fishermen brought them back to the dock. We'd tag them. We'd release them. Of those sharks, 94% of those survived. 94%. So what this tells us is, if shark's alive in a net and a fisherman shakes it out, there's a high likelihood of being alive. So, but what worried us was this. So we wanted to know more information. Well, when you're fishing, how do you fish, and why are some of the sharks dead? So one of the things that we found was that fishers, as they're trying to find the fish, the season's just started, they're trying to find the fish. If they're not finding any fish, they might leave their nets out longer. So what we found typically is if they leave their nets out longer, 40 hours or plus, that there's a higher likelihood that the shark will be found dead in the nets. However, if they check their nets in 24 hours, there's a very high likelihood that the sharks are alive in the nets. And we know now, based on our tagging, that a high proportion of these sharks can survive. So what this means is many of the management practices that the state has put in place to protect white sharks has been working, but can be improved. So unfortunately, the satellite tag data can be off a little bit. So we actually have other information that tells us exactly how close some of these sharks get to shore. So for example, this is a picture taken of a baby white shark jumping right off Will Rogers Beach. And from what I've been told, in some summers, if you go out early in the morning, you sit in the parking lot or you paddle out on your surfboard, you may actually be able to see this in Santa Monica Bay. So here's an aerial photograph that was taken by one of our spotters. PCH is right here, literally right here, I'll see him. This is a stand-up paddleboarder, and this is a stand-up paddleboarder. How many white sharks do you see? That's kelp. 5 little white sharks in an area the size of maybe 2 football fields, just offshore. So think about this. Off our beaches is probably one of the most important nurseries for the white sharks right here. And these little sharks in the summer are in these areas. And if they're off our beaches, they're safe from whatever gill netting is going on. So remember I told you we put our acoustic transmitters on our sharks, and we have acoustic listening stations along the shore? We have those acoustic receivers on many of the ocean piers, ranging from Morro Bay all the way down to San Diego. In fact, we now have some in Mexico. So here are some receivers that we have off Will Rogers Beach. This one is at Santa Monica Pier. So these are the number of detections that we got per baby white shark as they're swimming around during the summer. So we can see the bigger the circle, the more time they're spending in that area. We're getting detections on Manhattan Beach Pier, literally right on the pier. We had a big acoustic receiver array off Palos Verdes and in the port. We have a big telemetry project running in the port, and we've had 2 baby white sharks that have done laps through the port. Literally done in and out of Angel's Gate, back and forth for an entire day. We had 1 baby white shark that we tagged, Ventura, that we detected moving all the way down, came into the port, went to Mexico, and then 2 years later came back, came into the port again. And Mike, I hate to tell you this, went all the way up to the Coast Guard station and been in the port. So that's a 2.5-year-old. That's getting to be around 8 or 9 feet long. So the bottom line is these sharks as babies are spending a lot of time along our coast and in really shallow water. When it starts to get cold, we start to see these animals make migration south, and they'll literally pass by these ocean piers as they move south towards Baja. So using the satellite tags, we can actually track individuals' paths. So here's an individual that we tagged off Santa Monica. These are spot tag detections. Notice the shark spending most of its summer up here, moving back and forth along our beaches. And then by November, December, when our water temperatures typically start to drop, these sharks start making a beeline south. They start heading towards Baja. So these little white sharks migrate like coastal sharks, whereas the adults act like oceanic sharks. So one of the questions we've been trying to figure out is why certain beaches in Santa Monica and San Onofre? What makes these areas so special? And we've seen them shift areas that they use. So we actually have some new technology that we're developing to answer these questions. So one of the tools that we're using is we were developing shark tracking robots. These are fully autonomous program robots that we can put a transmitter on a shark, and we can have the robot go out, and we can tell the robot never get within 100 meters of the shark. And even while it's doing that, it can accurately determine the position, 3D position of the shark. And while it's doing that, robots, unlike us, can swim and chew gum at the same time. So it's measuring all these oceanographic parameters as it moves up and down through the water column. And by doing this, we can actually figure out where the sharks are going and what kinds of conditions they're looking for. So by using these autonomous tools, we're going to be able to answer why some of these sharks are along these beaches. So the prognosis for white sharks, if someone were to ask me now, based on the new things that we've learned and what I've learned from looking at other populations, I would say the prognosis for white sharks is quite good. I think our population is coming back, and I think the evidence for that is seen not just because more are being caught in this fishery that's basically disappearing. It's more are being good predators. We're seeing more and more white shark bites on sea lions and harbor seals, and their populations are really high. So I think there's good indications that these predator populations are coming back. So it's taken decades. Maybe one of the reasons why nobody's really noticed is it's literally taken decades or a century for it to happen. But the question is, how does it happen? So if it happens just for fisheries management alone, is that enough to allow the populations to come back? And I would argue no. It takes more than just fisheries management to do this. In fact, I would argue that we've been practicing ecosystem management in one form or another for 45 years now. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Magnuson-Stevens Act, Marine Life Protection Act. These things weren't done to save white sharks or marine mammals. They were done to clean up the ocean. So I think this may be our best ambassador for a sign that things are getting better and we can bring populations back. The white shark, the top of the food chain in our ocean, is a good example that we can do that. Now, with that said, the question people often ask, especially politicians, has all this acting done any good? And it's hard to say yes when we're constantly bombarded by bad news. And trust me, I'm not saying we've fixed everything. What I am saying is that all these hard-fought pieces of legislation have done some good. There are 3 times more people living in Southern California now than there were when many of these things were put into place. And things have gotten better. So if we hadn't done those things, this is what we'd be living in? Would this be our ocean now? So a lot of times it's easy to get negative about, things are bad. But this is the way things could be had we not done those things. So we still have problems. We have bigger problems. We've solved some regional ones, yes, and we've seen some great success. But we have global ones to deal with now. We have global climate change. We have ocean acidification. We have a lot of people to feed. We've topped over 7 billion people. So we need new solutions. Sustainable seafood, aquaculture. We need clean ocean energy that doesn't have impacts. We're restoring marine environments. We're coming up with clean shipping technology, better wastewater treatment. All of these solutions have to come from somewhere. And where are they coming from? Where have the ones come from that we've used so far to get where we are now? Well, hopefully, that will be all to see. So, the thing you have to remember is in Southern California, you have the highest density of world's experts in every one of those problems I just talked about. And we all work at different institutions, and we rarely get chances to talk, to work together to solve common problems. All to see will bring us all together under one roof. And the nice thing about that is it's not just marine science. It's developing engineering that will help us solve some of these problems. It's working with industry partners, people that can commercialize that. And more importantly, it's working with educators. We have to change people's behavior, and that can't be done from research alone, and it can't be done from engineering alone. So I'm really excited about AltaSea. I'm excited about the opportunities we're going to have there working together with our many partners. And I hope everybody will get to see what will become a true world-class, unique facility. Thank you.